Hello, I wanted to give you a bit of a guide on how to foundation piece. This is handy if you haven't done it before or if you just want a bit of a refresher. It does feel a little bit counterintuitive when you're sewing foundation piecing style sometimes, because while the templates are printed on this side, you're sewing on this side, your actual fabric is going to be right side up on here, and this is where your block's going to appear. So let's get started. I'm starting with the B template, mainly because I did the A template and did a video and I didn't love it, so we're redoing it. So bear with me. Now, what I like to do is have my fabrics ready to go. Now, based on the pattern, we've pre-cut them to size, and I like to put them in the order that they're going to be pieced in. So this is section B1, B2, B3, and so on, all the way through for the entire section. That way you have it next to your sewing machine, you grab it and go as you're sewing. It's super duper easy. Now, the first thing you're going to do when you're at your sewing machine is dial that seam length all the way down. You want it to be about 1.4 to 1.5. I wouldn't go much smaller because if you have to unpick those stitches, it's a bit of a nightmare. Now, the reason we do this with the seam length is because you've got to tear all this paper out at the end, and this way if your stitches are smaller, the paper comes away a lot easier without pulling out all your stitching too. Right, so that's the basics. Let's get started. Taking piece B1. Now when you put it on, we're not putting it on the printed side, it's going on the reverse. Again, it feels a bit like backwards sewing, but you'll get the hang of it. I'm just showing you on this side so you can see the lines quite clearly. You need to make sure your fabric covers that entire section plus at least a 1/4 inch seam all the way around the edge. That way when you join your sections, you're not going to have any gaps. So flip over your template and you can see the lines through the paper, and if you're struggling a bit, hold it up to the light, it'll help. Also use specialty paper for this if you're a bit unsure. I happen to have some with Riley Blake Designs, which is really handy for this because it's a lightweight paper and you can see through it a lot easier. So we are going to place this here on top. Now I do a lot of this, folding the fabric back so that I can make sure it's sitting all the way around that seam allowance. Now you can use a dab of glue or a pin to hold this one in place. I like to wing it and live on the edge, but you know, no judgment if you want to use pins. It will make your life easier, especially when you're beginning. Now our B2 section is this little triangle here, which we've got quite a large piece of fabric to go over it, which will make your life a bit easier. We are actually going to be sewing on this line. So what you can do is fold your template along that line, just so you have that line as reference when you're turning it over. So you give it a little bit of a fold. That's where we're going to be sewing. Okay, so let's put this back B1 in place, right about there, and you can see the fold. It gives you an idea of where you're going to put your template. Lay it across. Now make sure you've got a 1/4 inch across over your fold or your seam line. Okay, now again, you can pin this in place to hold it. I like to do this because it's more fun and I'm lazy, but make sure you hold your fabrics firmly when you put them under the presser foot, because sometimes they can flip up underneath and then they get caught and you sew them and you have to unpick, and yeah, it's not fun. So just do it carefully. Now when I stitch, I like to back stitch at the beginning and the end. It's a personal preference. I know a lot of people don't do it. At this point, I've been paper piecing for about 10 years. It's habit. So now we've got our seam done. Ta-da! But it's a bit messy. We need to get rid of that excess fabric. So fold your template back. We're just folding it back so we don't cut the paper. All right, and then I'm going to eyeball it, but you can use a ruler and a rotary cutter and just cut a 1/4 inch seam along here. Okay, scraps in the bin. Fold your piece back out. And you can kind of press it down like that, or you can use one of these magic tools called a finger presser. I like the one by Clover, it's quite nice. And that keeps your block nice and flat. It also saves you from having to go and use the iron on every single seam, because trust me, it would take a while. So we've done B1, B2. So we're going to add B3 now. So B3 is going to be on a little bit of an angle. So again, fold your template if you need to. Once you get the hang of it, you won't need that. But see that nice crease that's made there? That's just going to guide me on where that piece of fabric is going to sit. that will be the seam line. So again, you need to be a 1/4 inch over and make sure you've got it past there as well. So we're just going to put it into place. Again, pin the pieces of fabric together if you need to your templates while you're sewing, just until you get the hang of it. Or, you know, live on the edge and just like sew it and hope for the best. That's often my theory. Doesn't always work well, but you know. Okay, so we're going to rinse and repeat basically. We are just going to sew, trim, and then flip. Okay, so we've got the top part of the heart done now, like this. Okay, so we're getting there. Now the next section, I've put my fabrics in the wrong order. The next section is going to be B4, which is this bottom section. Now, I'm just showing you on the back of the template. Remember, it'll be on the other side. Make sure your fabric comes all the way out to this seam allowance. This part will get eaten up when you join your sections together into your block, or it will form the outside of your actual block. So you want it to come all the way out so that you don't end up with a scant seam allowance there. Okay, so again, if you want to fold your template if you need the line, or you can just do the back and forth flip method, which is the lazy girl's guide. So we're just doing that, and I'm making sure it's coming across all the way, a 1/4 inch on either side. Flip it over and hold it firmly in place, and then we're just going to stitch it down. This is a nice easy one. It's a nice straight seam across. The angles can get a bit tricky, but we'll talk about those in a minute. So there we go. You can see I've got my 1/4 inch. I probably could have shifted over a tiny bit, but it's close enough that we're going to go with it. All right, so let's trim this back. Now, if you have something that you want to be up the right way, like I just put the rainbow in, just check that when you're placing it. What you can always do is put your fabric on here first and just have a bit of a look, and then flip it up so you can see where it's going to sew. It just sort of gives you that visual in case you're a bit spatially challenged like I am. Okay, so now we're going to add the sides to the hearts, which are little triangles, but we've got big squares, so don't stress. They will fit easily. There's our line. Make sure you've got that magic seam allowance. Have I stressed that enough yet? I might do it another 4 times before we're done. So we're just sewing the corners onto the hearts. Trim it back. Do you see what I mean about rinse and repeat? We're tending to do a lot of the same things here. But that's the beauty of foundation piecing, is once you've got like this technique down of sewing on what feels like the wrong side and sort of sewing a bit counterintuitively, I guess, you can tackle pretty much any pattern. That's the thing. That's what I love about this technique. Like, yes, the pieces get smaller, the seams might get bulkier, but it's the same process. So you can keep sewing pretty much any pattern. Just get that technique down pat and you're golden. And I'll talk about how we join the sections together in a little bit. Right now, we're just focusing on the piecing. So our heart is starting to come together. There's the top. Okay, it doesn't really look like a heart yet. Bear with me, it will. We're going to add the side pieces. Again, they're fairly generous cuts. Like I've deliberately made them a bit bigger to make your life a little easier. If you're an experienced foundation paper piecer, you aren't going to need them quite as big. But I tend to be a bit frugal when I foundation piece and use smaller amounts. And I also like to use up scraps. Foundation piecing makes a lot of scraps, but it's also great for using up scraps. And I just like to be frugal with my fabric. But, you know, if you want to just piece with like gleeful abandon, go nuts. Just be mindful that you have limited fabric if you're sewing from the kit. And I would hate for you to run out before you got to finish it. Okay, so we're just trimming off the sides. Guess what? Our heart's nearly done. I'm just going to do the other side now, which is B8. Again, that magic seam allowance, you want to make sure it's folded, covering that whole section. Okay, Now, I'll talk about this in a little minute, but if your threads are starting to get a bit unruly on the back, like mine are, you can trim them like now. You don't have to wait till you finish piecing. You can do it at this point. Whatever you do, please don't leave all your threads hanging off. It really makes it messy, and it's a big job to have to cut them all at the very end. Do it as you finish each section, and it just keeps them under control. I'll show you what I mean. So when I trim the threads on the back, I like to use this little thread snip. It just makes it so easy. Just gather them together, trim it. See, they're all like, it's a bit wild and woolly, right? It looks like a right mess. So let's just trim them, and like, it'll just make me feel so much better if it's tidy again. See, look at that. It's like magic, tidy, tidy. Do you know, I've received blocks in swaps and people leave all their threads on the back. I've never understood that. Please make me happy by trimming your threads. Okay, so we're going to add this side section. All right. Again, magic seam allowance. Make sure it's coming all the way down, especially that end, because that's the curve. And you want your nice tidy seam allowance for that. And we are nearly at the end of our first heart, which is pretty cool. Trust me, by the time you finish this sew along, you're going to be an expert, because we're making a whole lot of hearts. Like there's, what, 12 in each block, and we're making 9 blocks. I don't like maths, so I'm not actually going to take a gamble and tell you how many that is, but it's a lot. So we are going to work on them 3 at a time so it doesn't feel so overwhelming. That's like how I like to approach it anyways. Look, my friends, we have a heart. And it's got a rainbow and a cloud in it. Pretty happy with that. So now we're just going to add the last section, which is the big one. And it might look, oh, fluff. It might look a little bit overwhelming. It's not. Well, we just want to make sure you put it the right way. That's a good start. Because it's 5 inches by 5.5 inches. It's a little bit off-putting because you go, oh, can't quite tell. But it is, you don't have a lot of wiggle room here. So just take a minute, pause, breathe, have a sip of wine if you need it, and make sure they're going to line up to cover it. So what you can do, which I mentioned before about flipping it over to make sure it lines up. So we're checking here. See, you need it to come, oh, I don't know if you can see that in this template. We need it to come out to here to cover that point. So you're trying to make sure that lines up on both sides. Now what you can do is flip it like that and go, hooray, it's covered the templates. Golden. Now, if you can just keep it in the exact same spot, ready to stitch it, you're golden. Okay, so look, have you noticed how many times I flip this and check that it covers? Honestly, it's worth doing that little extra eyeball and check that you've covered your seam allowances rather than having to unpick. I don't know if I've mentioned yet a time or 300 that I really don't like unpicking foundation piece stitches. So if you can just take that little extra second to check it and save you having to unpick, you'll thank me. And look, if you're not sure, before you trim your fabric, flip it back. Just do this, turn it over and go, right, have I got all my seam allowances covered by fabric? Yep, we're good. All right, now I'll trim it. Because if you're working from the kit and you've got limited fabric, you don't have a lot of wiggle room if you make an error. So again, just be a little cautious, take your time and double check things. Because if you have to unpick, at least then you still have your full amount of the fabric to re-sew and try that piece again. And here we have it. There is a heart section done. I'm going to just press that seam into submission. And then look what I'm going to do. I'm going to trim those unruly threads, because doing it now saves me a lot of time later. It's enough removing all the paper in one hit. So, okay, there's the heart. That is section B complete. And look, here's one I prepared earlier when I did the video that I marked up, and that's section A. So they're still a bit messy because you've still got all the edges on it, but I'm going to do a separate video. Look at me going with these videos. And I'm going to show you how we trim it up and how we join the sections together. So I'll be back and we'll talk then. So you've pieced together your first 3 sections and now you're wondering what to do next. So when we made these, we used the finger presser, right? Which made our seams nice and flat. But before you get to the next stage, take them to the iron and give them a really good press. You can use a little bit of starch if you need it, just to flatten it a little more, but otherwise a really hot iron will do the trick. So now we're going to trim these up, ready to join the sections. So it's a bit messy, it's like a scruffy dog, just needs a bit of a trim. When you are trimming it, this outside line is your trim line. Don't trim here, this is your sew line. Bad, stay away. Here, good. So put your ruler on and you just double check that it is actually printed to a 1/4 inch. You can see there's a 1/4 inch there. Trusty rotary cutter, trim, super easy. Probably should not have left that blade open, never mind. Okay, we're just going to do this like this. Now, oh look, I left threads, terrible. You can trim them while you're doing this. Make sure you line it up, especially on these edges like that. Okay, now with this, because the bottom's a curve, just leave that be for the time being. Scruffy dog at this end, tidy here. Okay, so there's one section done. Do that with the next ones. Again, leave those curves as they are, or untidy and unruly, because we are going to deal with those later when we're joining the curves, and it's easier if you leave it like that for the time being. Again, look, this is personal preference. You might go along and sew yours and go, Christy, what on earth are you talking about? I trimmed my curves. It was beautiful. It was a magical thing. And that's fine. That works for you? Go for it. Like, I am all about doing what works best for you. I'm just showing you the way I do things. You can take it or leave it. Promise I won't be offended. I won't even know. Okay, so section B. Trimmed up, which is our center section because it's got the biggest part. Now because I do a lot of foundation piecing, I actually have a separate mat and a separate ruler to use because I cut through the paper, and my mat's very messy. But you can use it on your regular one, totally fine. So here's our sections and here's how they're going to fit together. Look at that. So we are going to go and sew these seams, and then I'm going to show you how we join the curve. All right, talk soon. All right, it's time to join our sections together to make our first 1/4. Now you need to keep your stitch length down at 1.4 to 1.5 because these templates still have paper in them, and we want to make it easy to remove the paper from the seam allowances. We're going to work with section A and section B and join them together along here. So put the templates together, right sides. Now you notice on the template it's cut like that. That can actually help guide you on where you're going to join them. Now I don't like to cut both sides because I find sometimes it leaves a little gap in my stitching, but I just cut the one that's going to fit into the seam. So we're going to line that up and see that puts our point just up there. Try and keep the paper and the fabric together too in the same spot because it can shift a little bit. We are going to use pins for this part. Now the other part we want to make sure lines up is down here at the curve. So there's our curve along there. So just check. You can sort of go back and forth and go, is that lining up? Not quite. So you can shift it till it does. All right. And then you can pin it to hold it in place like that. All right, just a simple pin. Okay, and then we're going to sew as normal. Again, like before, I backstitch at the start and the end, just for that little bit of extra security and because it's habit. So we're just going to sew right along that seam line. I'm using a 1/4 inch foot, so that sort of helps me guide where I'm going to backstitch beginning and end. Okay, and then we can open this out and see it's lined up. Mine's just a fraction off, but it's matching up here. And that's the main thing. Now, make your life easier. Take these little bits of paper out, my friends. If you leave them in, your block doesn't sit as flat. So just fold it back, tear it out. Fold it just makes it a little easier when you tear it. Okay, Look at that. First part done. Now we're going to do the exact same thing. So this one, my template hasn't printed properly. That's my temperamental printer, but it was about there. I told you, I like to live on the wild side. Right, so let's line this up now. Now my template hasn't printed accurately, so yours would be a lot easier to see than this. Okay, so same as before. And we're just going to stitch down that seam. Sometimes they shift a little while you're stitching. Just adjust them as you go and as needed. Okay, and we're going to join this, and guess what? We've nearly got our first quarter done. Okay, so yes, you still have to do the tricky part with the curves, but don't worry, I'm going to talk you through that. Okay, open it out. Oops. Okay, see it's all lined up there. Beautiful. There's our first part. Again, take that skinny strip out. All right, just tear it out. Get rid of any threads along the way. Just keeps it a bit tidier when you come to the end. Also, you'll see, as soon as you remove that bit of paper, this will sit really nice and flat. And then you're going to take it over to the iron and give it a really good press. Now you can see my seams have already started sitting out, like out to each side. Once you iron that, it'll go down beautifully. And you can always add just like a little spritz of starch to make it super flat. Okay, so that's that section, and that's joined together. Now we are going to get ready to add the curve. It's all right, don't freak out, we got this. So I mentioned before not to trim your curve section. That's because you needed to sew it together to make sure it's done. So now you can trim your curve, and I just like to use the scissors, and I just cut. I know you really shouldn't use your scissors on paper, but you know, I make an exception on this because curves are tricky enough as it is. And I don't like using my rotary cutter to cut curves. But like I've said the whole way along, personal preference, want to use the rotary cutter and you've got a good eye for that, go for it. I don't. Mine would be like an absolute mess. Okay, curve ready to go. And here is the center section, center D. So you can see I've just pinned it on, trimmed it to size. We're not actually going to need that paper while we're sewing. That was just to show you how I put it together. There's my curve ready to go in the center. Okay, so to make this a little bit easier, now we've trimmed to the curve, we don't need this part of the paper anymore. So I like to remove this bottom section because then I'm just sewing fabric to fabric rather than fabric to paper. Also, we can put our stitch length back up. So if we muck up the curve and have to unpick, life is going to be a little bit easier, right? So go back to your normal stitch length of about 2.4. I think that's a setting that my machine loves to sit on. All right. Okay, it looks messy. We'll get better. Okay, first thing you want to do, take your curve, fold it in half, finger press a crease. Can you see that? Okay, and then put a pin along that crease so you can find it. Okay, do the same with the big chunky piece. Now you can remove all this paper if you want to. I prefer to leave it in because I feel like it just keeps the block a little more secure. But again, personal preference, experiment, what works for you. Now look, see my center line isn't exactly at the center of the heart there. Yours might be, sometimes it depends on my sewing. So it's fine, everything's fine. Okay, so we've marked the center line, we've marked the center line. We are going to match these up, center line to center line. You can take out those pins and pin them together. Now, I know really clever people who sew their curves without pins. I'm not one of them. So I'm going to show you how to do it with pins. If you want to do it without, feel free to experiment. Like, you know, it'll probably save you a lot of time with all this fiddling around. Okay, so we're going to take a corner of the curve to the outer curve. Now it's a bit like hard work, because you've got to fold the paper around and it doesn't want to play nice all the time. But you can line those curves up nicely and put a pin in it. Now, have lots of pins on hand. Like, I like to go nuts with pins. Like, more pins the better. Makes it a lot easier. Okay, so we're going to do the other side. So match up that and pin on that corner. Now look, we're looking pretty messy. It's it's a disaster. But trust me, there's a process, and when we get through it, it'll be great. So I'm just getting a couple more pins. And now this is a little trickier. You need to ease your curve to fit on both sides. So you're just kind of pushing it into submission, and then you're going to pin it. Now you can see this bit's a bit folded over. I'll just have to be very careful of that when I come to sew. But at the minute, we're fitting. Like, curves are tricky in that this pinning part's the worst part. When you come to actually sewing it, it's not so bad. Just take your time and practice. And bigger curves like this are easier. The smaller ones can be a lot more fiddly. And like, you know, we've talked about before, we'll be doing quite a few of these for this quilt. So by the end of it, hello, expert. Okay. I see mine's gone a little, there we go. Just keep it tidy. Okay, ready? We're gonna sew it. Okay, so I've just got my 1/4 inch foot on, and I've got my stitch length at 2.4. Now it's going to want to bunch up. You can see it's starting to bunch. So just kind of go right straight. And now this is probably going to be really tricky to show on video, but I hope you can see how it's going to work. See my curves? They're all nice and lined up. Okay, I don't sew over pins. I have a fear of them like breaking off and flying in my eye and blinding me. I may be like a slight catastrophizer, but you can sew over pins if you want to live on the edge, not me. So again, I backstitch beginning and end. I forgot to mention, I'm just going to put my needle on the needle down setting so that when I stop, it holds it in place. I also like to sew this part slowly, just so that I can make sure those fabrics are staying lined up together. Because sometimes they just get a bit unruly, and you just have to like remind them who's boss and what you're doing here. Because when they turn out to be a beautiful curve, this is all worth the effort. Okay, so you can see I take it slow. I move the pins as I approach them. Having your needle down just helps that stay in place while you're sort of awkwardly shifting all these papers around underneath the needle. Okay, so slowly does it. And just keep your fabrics lined up as best as you can. This is why I use a lot of pins, because it helps keep the fabrics in place. Like, I'm seriously in awe of people who sew without pins for curves. I don't have that magic skill. Maybe one day. All right, and every now and then you can lift your presser foot and just move it just to make sure you're on that curve. You'll find your machine kind of naturally feeds the curve through, but yeah, you can use a little bit of guidance and keep stitching carefully. Now when you get to the end, it wants to fold over, so you've really got to talk it out of that and hold it in place as best as you can. Right, and then we're back stitching at the end to hold it in position. Oh, ready for the big reveal. I'm like freaking out that there's going to be puckers, and you'll be like, what are you doing? But look, oh, no puckers. It looks a bit messy, but we're about to take it over to the iron and give it a really good press, and you're going to press it down. You can see I went a little wonky there. I can actually unpick that and tidy that up a little bit if it's starting to bug me, or if you have the same issue. See how you go after you've pressed this into submission. Starch, my friends, go nuts. It will help you keep your quarter nice and tidy. So I'm going to go and press that, and we'll be back to chat more. And there you have your quarter finished. So I used a dry iron and a bit of starch to get this to lay nice and flat. I also pressed the seam towards the curve here. That way you don't have it fighting with the bulk along with these seams, and still sitting fairly nice and flat. The other thing to check is that it's still fairly square. So you can put it like that and just have a look, make sure it's going to line up. so that when you join your blocks together, they're nice and square. If it gets a little bit wiggly down here, trim it up so that it all measures up nicely. So when you join your 4 blocks together to make the big block, it'll go together perfectly. So here's one that I did before using Create, and you can see the curves sit mostly flat. They're not always perfect, but that's okay, because the really cool thing is when you come to quilting, it covers a myriad of sins. So this is quilted for me by my friend Leanne of Mount Vincent Quilts, and she used an edge-to-edge panto with these really cute little heart motifs on it. And you can see it just made all the curves sit really flat. So don't freak out if your blocks aren't sitting perfectly flat. Once you get to the quilting stage, it'll cover up a lot of errors. Well, not errors, you know, any issues you've got if they haven't quite lined up perfectly. No one's going to see it from a distance. The main thing is you're going to have a beautiful quilt that you love. I can't wait to see your blocks, and I'm really looking forward to sewing along with you over the next few weeks. Make sure you share them on Instagram using the hashtag heartfeltsew-along, and that way you'll be in the running for prizes each week. Plus, you get a pretty quilt. All right, happy sewing.